Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Dan Monzani and I'm Aurora's Managing Director for UK and Ireland and European Hydrogen. My guest today is a good friend of Aurora's and one of the most high-profile voices on the energy transition in the UK and internationally. He was until last month the Chief Executive of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, the independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act in 2008 to advise both the UK national government and its devolved governments on emissions targets, strategies, and to report to Parliament on progress. He is now CEO of the Carbon Trust, a global climate consultancy which helps organisations globally with their target setting, net zero pathways, assurance, footprinting, and programme management. My guest today is Chris Stark. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, Dan. It's lovely to be with you again, and good to hear you use the formal term Committee on Climate Change again. That's what I like to see.
Important to get the grammar right, I feel. So, Chris, I suppose the obvious question to start with, you've been at the CCC for about 6.5 years. Lots to talk about, and we'll unpack that in a minute. But why did now feel like the moment, and why the Carbon Trust?
Gosh, I'm not sure there is ever really a good time to leave the CCC. I absolutely loved my time there, but I also felt that the story was moving on a bit. And it's funny when you've done a job for that length of time. Now, many people have done jobs for longer than 6.5 years, but in the time I did that job, the story on climate in the UK changed a lot. And we'd moved out of the sort of rush towards net zero being, enough to get stuff done. You could slap net zero on any old thing and people were supportive of it, into what I think is actually a more interesting period where the path ahead is becoming a far harder one to follow and a far more pragmatic set of actions are required. And I could just see that actually I was more associated with the last era than I was the next. And I felt it was time for me to make a change so that I can be more relevant in the next part of that journey. So after 6.5 years, I thought it's time to change. And I also feel very strongly that for organizations like the CCC, and there's not many of them, but those sorts of organizations should have a change at the top fairly regularly. You shouldn't have people doing those jobs for 10 plus years. So it was time to move on.
Very good. We'll come back to the new role in a bit, but let's dig into the CCC a bit. Over 6.5 years, there's a lot happened in that time. What are you most proud of, and do you have any regrets?
Oh, I've got definitely lots of regrets, but let's maybe start with what I'm proud of. I'm definitely proud of the work that we did to advise a net zero target for the country. That's probably what I'll be remembered for. More proud, funnily enough, of what we did after that. So your listeners may recall back in 2018, the Commission came to the CCC to look at the long-term target, the 2050 target, to check whether UK had a target that was in line with the obligations that we had under the Paris Agreement, the Global Climate Accord. And we said, actually, it's time to set a net zero target. And we threw a lot of evidence behind that, looking at the global science, looking at what we felt was an achievable pathway, what it meant to, build proper ambition around this. And very happily, almost in the dying days of the Theresa May government, she put that target into law on the basis of that advice. And the bit that happened after that is the bit I'm probably most proud of, actually. So net zero gets put into law, and then we threw absolutely everything at trying to illustrate what the path to net zero would actually look like for the country. So we had 5 different scenarios for achieving net zero, all of them slightly different. One of them a very ambitious scenario. And it was just a brilliant experience to do that. And I mean, when I talked earlier about the story moving on, that's part of the challenge, actually, is that I am associated with those 5 scenarios. I have a very keen sense of what they are. But in reality, what actually is done to get to net zero will probably involve a load of trade-offs that is for the next carbon budget to look at. So that's coming next year, and that's exciting to see.
Very good. I remember the debate around the net zero emissions, and actually one of the concerns many of us had at the time was that the unabated 20%, we for those listening overseas, we had a commitment to reduce emissions by 80%, and the unabated 20% provided too good a hiding place, in my view. Sort of about 80% of the economy believed it was in the 20% that didn't have to
definitely
change.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think the dial's finally moved, or do you think the net part still provides a hiding place for polluters? Does everybody realise they're going to have to make a move?
I mean, I think the net part does provide a bit of a hiding place, but it's not a very comfortable one. And I definitely feel that, having net zero is essentially a 100% reduction in emissions. So having a 100% target doesn't leave any doubt that every part of the economy plays some sort of role in it. But I think this story of what we do on the other side of the ledger, with offsets and removals, is going to be the big talking point. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to come to Carbon Trust, because I think it's really important that there's some good advice on this out there, because we're going to need it. You do need the net bit in net zero, but not everyone's going to get to use it, because there's not enough. There aren't enough removals to go around. So it's going to be, I think, the big topic for the next few years.
We should dig into that a bit more, actually, because I mean, completely agree. Everything we model, even in power, which is supposedly the easy bit of this, the last bit is incredibly hard and expensive. And so it may well be that everybody has to decarbonize a lot, and it's only the very last bit that anyone gets to offset. I mean, do we have any credible story on removals in the UK? I mean, there's talk about BECCS, but we haven't yet done it, and we haven't seen the technological breakthroughs perhaps that others would hope for. Do you think there's a credible story, or one that might emerge in the next few years?
I certainly feel that we could have a credible story. And just to give you a sense of this, I won't bandy around too many numbers, but in that big assessment that we made for the UK's 6th carbon budget, for your listeners who are not so attuned to this, we make an assessment every 5 years in the UK of what the country needs to do to hit the long-term goal. And those are called carbon budgets. And a target is set around a future 5-year period. So the 6th carbon budget was really an amazingly interesting thing to look at, because it takes you into the mid-2030s. And that is the critical period. And what's interesting is, in every one of those 5 scenarios that I talked about, there is something to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We had, in the central scenario, about 100 megatons. And don't worry if that number means nothing to you, but it's quite a big number in removals terms. And it's notably round, if I can put it that way. So, and that's because there's a lot of uncertainty about how much you can do with removals. So 100 megatons tells you that we were making an informed guess, I suppose, about how much the country could achieve by 2050. So 100 megatons by 2050, but about half of that is what we would expect the natural world simply to mop up. So this is basically planting trees, restoring peatland. And the other half, 50 megatons, is what we call engineered removals. That's the bit I'm interested in. So engineered removals involves us having to invest in, actual infrastructure and technologies to either take carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and then pipe it away and store it in mostly the North Sea. And that's direct air capture. Or to ask something of nature, essentially to grow some biomass, let's call it a crop or the residue from some forestry, and then use that in an energy process, but capture the carbon and store that away. So that's what we call BECCS. And the 50 megatons or so is something I'm sure that the CCC will look at again in the next carbon budget assessment. It's probably ballpark where we need to be. But you don't get to just name numbers like that without making steps immediately to build the infrastructure to pull it off. So my own view is that the BECCS bit of it, and that is using biomass in that way, is naturally quite a limited thing, because you're asking a lot of biomass in all sorts of the parts of the economy, and we can't use it everywhere as a replacement for fossil fuels. So there is a constraint on the amount of land that we can use globally to produce the biomass that we might use in the energy system. So we probably will need to look to direct air capture and the technologies there, but those are expensive. We're talking seriously expensive technologies there. And although when you pull it off, you can do essentially unconstrained removals, it's the cost of that acts as the constraint rather than how much land you've got. So there's no free pass here, which is why the central strategy has to be to cut emissions directly, leaving only what we absolutely must at the end to do the net bit in net zero. And I think it's worth me saying now, I'm not at the CCC now, but I think there is a world where we are going to have to talk about net negative. And some parts of the world do have a key set of attributes that might allow them to do removals more actively than others. The UK might be one of those because we've got such big storage assets for the carbon. So there is quite an important job, I think, for us to try and imagine what that might look like. So some countries of the world might need to go net negative, quite seriously net negative, to mop up the emissions that are remaining in other parts of the world. And that is a very difficult discussion to have now, as lots of people have been debating whether even net zero is achievable.
I guess actually, even if you felt everybody was going to get to their targets, you'd still want to accelerate the removal of the existing carbon as fast as possible, wouldn't you? And we're already on a track that's not particularly attractive, even if we hit the targets.
Totally. I mean, it's a really important point. I mean, I spent, it's quite interesting looking back in my 6.5 years, and I've worked on climate policy now for 13 years. So I look back over the last decade or so, the most vociferous arguments that I have are usually with people in the green community, rather than the skeptical voices who are certainly not in the green community, although I have arguments with them too. But this question of what we do with carbon capture is one of the most controversial topics for some of the green activists, at least. But the story, as I see it at least, is that if you haven't got carbon capture as an option, all you are doing is increasing the volume of emissions that you expect over the area under the curve, as we say, over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So you would want this to be part of your arsenal, alongside absolutely the priority that we need to give to cutting emissions directly. We can also lower cumulative emissions if we've got carbon capture in play. And carbon capture is then the step to doing full greenhouse gas removals, because that's the infrastructure that you would use to then take away, transport and store that carbon. So we do need to develop this, and it's the challenge, I suppose, is that it's not a conventional market in any sense. So it's going to have to be policy led. Very, very unlikely you'd be doing very expensive greenhouse gas removals without some very big policies behind it. So getting the commercial interest to develop this infrastructure, it's really tough. You've got to make sure that those policies are in place. There's a social license question as well. The people who are actually doing the removals and doing the investment in that need to be confident this isn't going to be harmful to their reputation. So, this stuff matters, and we need to start to see infrastructure in the ground before 2030 if we're going to believe that pathway I talked about is still on the table.
Do you think we're on? Do you think we're on track with carbon capture? And actually, it's a related question to that. Even if we are on track, has the government committed at sufficient scale to give the headroom that you're talking about beyond the initial projects to pipe more carbon dioxide under the North Sea?
So I don't think we're on track, but we're certainly closer to the track than we were a few years ago. I think one of the key things is that my old department, the Treasury, has now accepted the wisdom of carbon capture as being the lowest cost pathway, being on the lowest cost pathway, at least part of the mix. The challenge, I think, is that you need to be really sure what you're doing with it. And I think this is one of the ways in which the story has developed, that we've moved off thinking that carbon capture was essentially, a sort of something you attach to the chimney of a power station, into, I think, a more sensible discussion about using it very sparingly, probably mostly in industry, in those areas where you haven't got an alternative, and possibly in the production of hydrogen too, blue hydrogen production, as a means to bridge that gap to having a big enough power system to do the electrolysis for green hydrogen at the scale you require. So I think there is that kind of story now there. Will we do enough of it? Ultimately, I suppose it depends on the willingness of the Treasury to fund that in the UK and treasuries around the world to do the same thing, because it is something where you really do need the involvement of the state. I think there is another interesting angle to this, though, which is that we haven't really seen this tried anywhere, but in my mind, at least, there are a set of polluters who expect to continue to pollute past 2050, notably the aviation sector, who I think should be more interested in removals as a means to decarbonise with credible offsets, really genuinely scalable, credible, high authenticity credits. And they should therefore be interested in bringing down the cost of those key technologies. We've not really seen that kind of idea of a sort of bilateral arrangement being set up. That might be something that helps us along. But in physical terms, in the UK, we are moving too slowly, I think, to develop the infrastructure that we need at the scale that's required and at the time that it's required. So I worry now about some of the CCS targets that we have.
Yeah, that aviation point is a really interesting one. Would you envisage a purely voluntary market, or is this something like transport, where actually I think it's been quite a success globally from a regulatory point of view in putting a ratchet on the manufacturers to develop EVs, electric vehicles, because they need to lower the average fleet emissions. And so if they want to sell internal combustion engines, then they have to sell more EVs. And so it's actually redirected huge flows of R&D into electric vehicles. And the result is what we see today. Is that something you'd see in aviation?
Possibly. Just step back from aviation. One of the reasons it's such an interesting topic is because of the fact that it will very likely be the largest cause of emissions by mid-century, alongside agriculture. And it's the reason I find it such an interesting topic is because there's only really 3 or 4 things you can do to decarbonize aviation. So you've got the question of the technologies themselves. So what plane you're flying and how efficiently it uses the fuel that you put in it is obviously one of them. There's then the question of the fuel that you put into that plane, and lots of interest in sustainable aviation fuels, very, very important. And then there's the very vexed question of the demand for aviation itself. So can you shave off some of the seemingly insatiable demand for the world to fly? But even if you pull all the levers, any sensible assessment of that tells you that by the middle of the century, you won't have dealt with all the emissions in aviation. So I think that this 4th element of what you do in that sector to encourage real removals, not just planting trees that would be grown anyway, I think is the story that hasn't yet come alive. And there is a link back to the story of the sustainable aviation fuels, because we need carbon capture to work for that too. So if we're doing direct air capture, for example, to make the jet fuel, that should help too. So I think there's a story here of the aviation sector itself being more involved in the commerciality of carbon capture and removals that we haven't really explored. I suppose one of the other implications of that is something that I know that many in the aviation sector don't want to hear, which is that it may be, if you could bring down the cost of, let's say, direct air capture can be brought down to a much lower cost, it may be that you simply burn kerosene and then do removals alongside it, as that being the cheapest way to do the whole thing. But that does rely on the sector itself grabbing it and taking hold of it and doing it well. So all of this is incredibly controversial, but it's so important that we think it through. And I think the final thing I'll say, as someone who lives in the UK and still works majority of my time in the UK, the aerospace sector in the UK is one of our genuine, our strengths. It's one of our global strengths. So I think there's the story here again of the UK deciding to do something well in, a handful of areas. And I would like to see us do well on the aviation story, because we've got all these comparative and competitive advantages to do that.
Excellent. Just final thought on the CCC. While we're talking about it, the institutional framework is probably about 15 years old now. I guess when we look at our modelling, even in power, we've made most progress. The government still doesn't really have a credible plan to get to net zero by 2035. We see almost 15 grams of net emissions at that point, let alone obviously in clean heat and transport, where they've actually retreated from the commitments. Do you think that undermines the institutional framework? Are there ways we could strengthen it? Or do you think it's doing its job and politicians still have to decide?
I'm not sure it's an easy answer, that one. I think the CCC is a wonderful institution, and one of the things that's good about it is that it is not a regulator, and it is not a policymaker. And I think we get ourselves into difficulty when we, who are now outside the CCC, including me, view it as a force that it isn't. It doesn't have any teeth. All it has is advisory power. And the only power that brings, I suppose, is if everyone else thinks what they advise is a good idea. And to date, that's what's happened. So I think the CCC itself is in a very good position. I think the framework around it is perhaps more interesting. And I was worried until yesterday, actually. We're recording this on the 22nd of May. But yesterday, the government made a very, very important announcement, which didn't get much coverage. That they were not going to take what's called the flexibility. So a very brief explanation of this. Every 5 years, there's a carbon budget. And if you exceed that carbon budget, if the country exceeds that, if it outperforms, that's a better term, that carbon budget, then there's a residual amount, sort of surplus emissions, that you, in theory, can roll over into the next carbon budget to make it easier. And the last carbon budget that the country had within it the COVID period, So there was a very big surplus, larger than we would expect normally in the normal course of things. And the government did have the option to roll that into the next carbon budget period and essentially make the target meaningless. And they decided not to do that, which was the advice of the Climate Change Committee. But it basically is a very important thing because it means that the next carbon budget is going to be tight. And the one after that is going to be tight too. So that decision, although it didn't get much coverage, means that we still have an institutional and legal framework for climate in the UK that means something. So I think all of that is in the mix. You raised, I think, a more interesting question beyond that, though, Dan, which is what happens if this stuff doesn't come off? What happens? What does that mean for the CCC if the advice that it's offered isn't followed? And on that, again, as someone who led the CCC for 6.5 years and now as a keen observer of the CCC, I think that's fine. I think it's okay for the CCC to have offered a whole set of recommendations and analytical advice, and for the government to take a different approach. And if the government then subsequently finds that it's off track on some of its key pledges, like the decarbonisation of the power sector, then the CCC is a very important voice in what you might do to bring that back on track again. And the fact that it's got extant recommendations in a host of areas that weren't followed is just part of the more compelling evidence of what should have been done in the first place. So the power target is one that in particular is really important. I continue to work on the energy transition outside the CCC. It was my view that we should try and put a date on the date by which we should decarbonise power in the UK. And it sits in the mid-2030s somewhere, although the Labour Party, if they come in, want to do it earlier than that. But that is so important. The reason it's so important isn't because of the power sector itself. It's because all of the users of power, that is, people and businesses in the UK economy, they have a really clear offer after that point. If you plug in your electrical technology and it's zero carbon, is the message you'll get. And if you can say that that is the case from a date in the mid-2030s, the whole story of decarbonisation in the wider economy suddenly comes alive. It's mainly about electrification. So the longer that date drifts, and the longer that we are not sure how it's going to be achieved, the more worried I am, not about the power sector, but about the wider users of power. What's at the end of the line? And that's, for me, the great sadness is that we haven't got a plan yet to fully decarbonise the power system. We will need it.
Yeah. You've also been pretty critical of Rishi Sunak's rollback of various commitments that are adjacent to the power sector, things like heat pumps, electric vehicles. Do you think those steps have a lasting impact with investors, or is it just froth, pre-election froth, and actually investors can look through that and look at the long-term direction that the world's going in?
No, I think it's more than froth. And you're right, I was critical of the Prime Minister for the speech he made in Downing Street on September last year. I mean, partly because he made such a song and dance of the speech. He got the lectern out and he stood in Downing Street and he told the country he was doing some major thing on net zero. And my frustration was principally that he didn't do anything major on it, actually. So that he's sort of pushing everyone up the garden path, when in fact what he announced in policy terms was not a great shift. But having, set everyone up to expect a great policy shift, that's what led to the overinterpretation of what he did. So he moved some key dates, including, what the country had been planning to do on the heat pump rollout, and probably more notably still, the dates by which we would stop selling petrol and diesel cars. He moved that out to 2035 from the Boris date of 2030. Neither of these things, and there were other things in there too, are actually that important. But the message is that we are stepping off, the leading ambition that we had prior to that to develop these technologies and roll them out. Now, you could say to me, and I might even agree with you, that this doesn't matter that much, but the investment community notices this stuff. And while all this is happening, this very sort of internal discussion within the UK, other parts of the world are making big strides on these electrical technologies. So heat pump rollout, you go somewhere like Italy, heat pump rollout through the roof because during the real peak of the energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they really went for it as an idea that this is the way to combat Putin was actually to get off the gas that was being supplied into Europe with heat pumps. Other parts of the world have done that too. You go to China and you see just absolutely stonking rollout of electrical technology, especially EVs, partly because the industrial base is there, but also because of air quality concerns. But these are going to be genuine competitive advantages for those economies, I think, in the future. So I sort of worry that we've just been having this potted debate again, ignoring all the things that are happening around us and doing, I think, a lot of damage to the need for investor certainty about the priorities for the country.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of criticising people for paring back action is to criticise people for being hubristic. And you also advised the Scottish Government, both actually in the Scottish Government as a civil servant before the CCC and then in the CCC. And they've just cut back their climate targets. Do you think the real problem there is a lack of political will to deliver them, or was it just setting impossible hubristic targets in the first place?
I think there's a mixture of both going on there. I have to say, I did not expect my final act at the Climate Change Committee to be the dissolution of a whole government. But that is essentially what happened after we gave a really careful bit of advice to them. So just wind the clock back a little. Scotland has its own Climate Change Act. This was the Alex Salmond administration. So 2008, the UK passed this world-leading piece of legislation on climate, and Alex Salmond thought, I'd like a piece of that, please. So he passed a similar piece of legislation in the Scottish Parliament. And it was sort of mirror image of the UK legislation, dealing obviously only with the Scottish economy. And it had targets within it, and it had a 2050 target of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, same as the UK's. So we had that for a while, and then the net zero work came along. My team advised net zero for the UK and net zero for Scotland, and both of those targets were accepted by the governments north and south of the border. Scotland's target was for 2045 net zero, UK was 2050. And that was interpreted wrongly by many as meaning that Scotland should have more ambition on net zero than the rest of the UK. In fact, it's a product of the UK target. If the UK is to hit net zero by 2050, then Scotland will get there slightly earlier because it's got more opportunities to store carbon, mainly in the natural world. So 2045 became the date. What happened after that is the bit that I think we might talk more about, which is the role of politics in defining the path to that goal. So huge amount of work had been done by us on, illustrating the net zero economy that we would have in Scotland by 2045. But we hadn't been able to do a full pathway to that. So the Parliament at that stage said, well, hang on, we'll do that for you. So they set a 2030 goal that we said at the time was beyond anything that we could model. So they set a goal to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 from their 1990 levels. And remember, you have to get to 100% by 2045. So we felt straight off that was an extremely difficult target to hit. We genuinely didn't have any modelling to support it, but we did offer some advice on what could be done to go faster than the CCC pathways. That advice was not taken up by the Scottish Government. And in fact, what we've had is, because the 2030 target was so hard, we've had this period of what I might call stasis in Scotland in policy making altogether. I think basically they were like rabbits in the headlight. They had this impossible target for 2030, which just got harder and harder the longer you wait, and no policy programme that could deliver it, really, especially towards the end of it. So we called that out this year at the CCC and said that we thought the target was beyond what was credible. But the Greens were in coalition with the SNP and the Scottish Government, and understandably, some of the members of the Green Party just couldn't live with that. So there was this whole movement then to pull out of the coalition, which Humza Yousaf decided to head off by doing so first. So all of that really has shaped the whole of Scottish politics now, and it's quite interesting to see how important these climate issues and politics can be into overall politics. But what's interesting about that 2030 goal is the Scottish Government essentially got outbid as a minority administration on that target. So they didn't want that 75%. It was a kind of combination of the Tories and the Labour Party. And it's interesting, the Greens abstained because they wanted an even harder target than 75%. So the numbers wouldn't stack up, and the SNP government, then a minority administration, decided they'd just have to live with 75%. So that's what happens when politics gets involved without the benefit of some data and analysis, I think.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, you'd like to think that maybe the political calculus on setting unrealistic targets is probably shifted. I mean, it couldn't have had more of a consequence for the First Minister. However, south of the border, Labour are committing to a 2030 target, which I have to say I find slightly. Maybe I'm being too glass half full, and I'd be interested to know your perspective on this. But I mean, we don't think that having zero carbon in the power sector by 2030 is deliverable. You get closer than if you make the efforts to get there than you would have done otherwise, perhaps. But should we be having a debate more about means than ends in the forthcoming general election? What would you like to see the parties contest? What are we not talking about that we should be when we're sort of debating whether it's 2035 or 2030?
So let's talk about that, because I think it's really important stuff. And I'll start on a different topic, if I may, which is to just comment on the amount of political capital that has been spent on a totally different issue, which is oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. So I commented on this as I left the CCC, and I'll just quickly recap on it now. But that essentially has been the battleground on climate policy for the last couple of years, believe it or not. So we've been having this debate about whether to do new oil and gas licensing in the UK. And interestingly, the government has led that by trying to enforce an annual cycle of oil and gas licensing in what is a dwindling basin. And the Labour Party have quite happily accepted the debate there and the territory for the debate, and have similarly debated whether to have oil and gas licenses, and have concluded that they're sort of half in, half out on what the government wants to do. Meanwhile, none of that matters at all, really, in terms of climate policy in the UK. I mean, there is some marginal impact, of course, in having new oil and gas licenses, but there is no political capital left now, I think, to support the really difficult stuff that needs to be done in the power sector, as we've described, in the heat pump rollout, district heating, what we're doing with electric vehicles and charging, what we're doing with industry, these things, what we're doing with farming. These things need solid political support with ambitious ministers who've got an idea of what policy can be done. And if all the oxygen has been sucked out of that in a debate about oil and gas licenses, then it's very difficult to get that policy made. So that's my observation on what's happened in the last couple of years. You're probably picking up an element of frustration in my voice, because I felt that we were talking about the wrong stuff for far too long. Coming to the power target then, we advised in the CCC that it was possible to decarbonise the power sector by 2035, but we did so on the basis that we wouldn't fully decarbonise it in the true meaning of that sentence by 2035. So we did some important work, I think, to try and model a year's operation of the UK power system, the GB power system, in 2035, and concluded that it was very sensible to have some unabated gas remaining on the system. If you were only using it for a few hours a year, that was a set of emissions that you could live with and cope with elsewhere in the economy. So we had plenty of scope to manage that. And that's still my view, is that by the middle of the 2030s, we really should have the job done. Interestingly, if we're to hit that kind of goal by 2035, we would be 90% of the way by 2030. So I don't know what the Labour Party is going to do on this, but they are committing to this 2030 pledge. I think it could be done if you really threw everything at it, and this sort of wartime effort that Ed Miliband, the UK's shadow energy spokesman, the war effort he talks about is, I think, the right way to view it if you want to try and hit it earlier. The reason to hit it earlier is probably not because of the emissions impact, because the difference between 2030 and 2035 is very small, as I've just described. But it does have a transformative effect potentially in infrastructure terms for a host of other things. So just briefly on this, Dan, I'm sure you know this better than I do, but if you want to decarbonise your power system quickly, the answer isn't just to throw up new offshore wind farms in the UK or to do new solar or new onshore. You've got to look at the thermal fleet of power stations, because it's gas that's allowing us to have renewables on the system because it's so flexible. And we need basically a decarbonised version of that fleet to get to a fully decarbonised power system. And you need the batteries, of course, that people talk about for system flexibility and resilience alongside that. But it's the fleet of power stations that matters. And I think if you really ran at it, you could see a world where the 30 or so transmission connected gas-fired power stations that we have on the GB system could be converted, some of them at least, to something like hydrogen or potentially carbon capture. And could that be done in 5 years? Well, it could be. Will it be? I think that's the question, because the challenge is, therefore, where do you put the infrastructure for hydrogen and carbon capture? can you get sufficiently focused on those bits, actual bits on the map, places on the map where you're going to do that? And those places will naturally be where you're also storing hydrogen and storing carbon. And I think that's the challenge, because that runs in the face really of how we've run the electricity market, the wholesale electricity market, for a number of years now. So could it be done? Yes. Will it be done? Well, it'll involve a hell of a lot of change very quickly if we're going to do it.
Yeah. Let's look at another area, which again, the Committee on Climate Change put a lot of work into, which is around how much it costs to get to net zero. I mean, there's the sort of macro question, is it affordable? But I actually quite like to zoom into the micro and look at a case study around, look at Tata Steel, for example. I mean, so they've announced they're closing their blast furnace at Port Talbot. That's converting it to an electric arc furnace. I think that's something like 15 to 20% of Wales's total carbon emissions. So from a climate point of view, something to be welcomed. But I mean, it still costs thousands of jobs in an economically disadvantaged area. And I suppose this might be just another example of the kinds of things we're not talking about adequately, which is, what are the costs to government of managing that kind of shift? And is that scalable across the whole of our industry?
Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant question and a very good example to go alongside it in Port Talbot. Standing back and looking at the whole economy, which is often what organisations like the CCC do, you can look at the set of industries that we will have for net zero, and you can look at the employment impacts that go with the transition to net zero. And the surprising, slightly counterintuitive conclusion from all the work that we did on skills and jobs is that there isn't that much change at all required in terms of industry makeup. So you've got a set of most people working jobs already that will be largely unaffected by the transition to net zero. And in those areas where there is a change, you've got plenty of time to plan. There are a handful of areas, though, where that is not the case. And you think about this sort of real sort of hardcore oil and gas linked jobs, be that oil and gas extraction or steel production using coke and coal, and you see that there really is an employment impact there. And what's interesting and what's difficult about the transition away from those fossil fuels industries is that there is a geographical location to those jobs. That is one of the features of it. If you are in a non-impacted industry like the service sector, the jobs are dispersed right across the economy in all the geographies. But if you work in Aberdeen on oil and gas or in Port Talbot on steel production, then you really do notice the impact on jobs. So I think there's a job for all of us who work on this to tell a more accurate story about what this change actually looks like. My take on it, I suppose, is that it's a terrible tragedy for anyone who works in Port Talbot in this area, but we are not competitive unless we can have that green steel production. And it's a more efficient way of producing that steel. So in one sense, what we're doing is shoring up industry in that area, but that is cold custard to anyone who's going to see the employment impact. So I think it therefore follows that if this is the route that we follow, then we've also got to think about what else we put in those areas to bolster the low carbon production that is done in a host of other areas, a host of other industries alongside that. And that's possible. So, that requires an industrial strategy. And I'm not in the CCC now, so I can say that I think the country really does need an industrial strategy. I don't think it's that controversial to say that. If we had an industrial strategy, there'd be a far better story to tell you, I think, about what was going to happen in Port Talbot or in the wider area, what's going to happen with oil and gas industries in Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland. And these are just two examples. There are others. So the jobs bit of it, I think we haven't done as good a job in explaining that, firstly, it's not as threatening as you might think it is. Many of the unions present it as a huge threat, and I don't think it is. But in those areas where there is an impact, we need to have a plan. So we need a strategy. And then the other bit is the cost generally, and that's the other half of what's sometimes called the just transition, which is not a term I like particularly, but the just transition is partly about jobs. It's often how it's framed, but I think it's also about how fair the transition is generally and who pays. And that is, I think, where the action's really at, because in my assessment, we are going to have a period of cost on the journey to net zero over the next decade. And that cost, which is really an upfront investment that the country is making in a host of low carbon industries and technologies, is really worth it in the 2030s, because you basically have a far more productive and competitive economy at the end of that, and consumers pay less for energy. But you've got to get through that next 10 years. And in a world where the fiscal constraints that government face are tight, then I think it is challenging. So I've got ideas what you could do about that, but I'm also sure that there isn't an easy answer to that. If you are, I've said this before, but if you are struggling to pay your gas bill right now, it is highly unlikely you're going to go and shop for a more expensive heat pump to replace it. So we will need the state to step in those areas where it is simply impossible to expect consumers, be they individuals or businesses, to make these investments. And there is a cost to that. I think it pays off, but it's got to be something that we talk about.
Let's talk about the Carbon Trust again. So we started there, and you talked a little bit about some of the motivation for moving there. But perhaps you could expand a bit on how the Carbon Trust has an impact and what it is you personally want to achieve there in your tenure.
Really happy to do that. So I, as you might expect, loved my job at the CCC, but also felt I wanted to think carefully where I went next. And I'm happy to say, a few offers to do things in various areas, often consultancy, and none of them felt quite right to me, because part of it, I want to continue to be focused on this whole mission that we have to decarbonise the global economy, and I felt I could do that better at a place like Carbon Trust than anywhere else. Carbon Trust is quite an unusual organisation. It was once a quango. It was once part of the government, and during George Osborne's bonfire of the quangos in the early 2010s, it was cast out to wash its own face, and that's what we are now. So as an organisation, we are non-profit making in the sense that we make commercial returns, but we put them all back into the mission of decarbonising the economy. So in that sense, we're unusual, and we work with government and business to do that. So we're in this sort of amorphous sandwich between government and business, which is, to me, the most interesting place to be, because I think that's where the interesting policy gets made and the interesting decisions by corporates get made. All of that, is out there. The thing I'm most interested in, I suppose, now I'm here, is doing sort of three things. So I feel like there is a sort of Wild West still out there in terms of the approach that's been taken to things like carbon footprinting and setting targets around reducing carbon. You still find corporates who have things like 2030 net zero targets, seemingly for the whole business, but we know that that's not really credible. So I'm very much of the view that, number one thing, we need to view this as a transition. That means that it happens over time. Transition to net zero by the middle of the century. But that means that depending where you are in the economy, depending where you are in the world, that transition will look different to you over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And we need to view it that way. This is something that will change over time, and you need to align to what we think the best path to that is as much as possible. So Carbon Trust can offer that kind of advice. That will involve doing some of the things that Carbon Trust already does very well, like carbon footprinting and target setting, but it means having a broader view of what the transition actually looks like. So if you're in that aviation sector, we talked about aviation earlier, it is going to be a shallower fall in emissions than if you're in the power sector. So you'd give you a sense of that transition will look different wherever you are. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what marks us out from mainstream consultants is I think we also have a real interest in accelerating the transition. We are here, we have a mission, it is published, we're an organisation that is set up to deliver that. That means us being experts and specialists in certain aspects of this transition and actively accelerating it where we can, especially by bringing together industries to collaborate to do that. And we've done that well in a few areas, and I want to do more of that. And then the third thing, probably most interesting to you and your listeners, Dan, is that if I'm right on all that, then our credibility rests on us being more of a public voice with analysis, with evidence, with data about that transition. So I would like to see Carbon Trust move to being more of an organisation that publishes that work, puts it out there. We already do some of that, but is seen as an analytical force on the transition. Not all of it, because you can't boil the ocean, but in those areas where we feel we've got expertise, to really lead that and to produce a proper analysis that has depth as a means actually to demonstrate our credentials in those areas. So those three things are what I pitched when I came to the Carbon Trust, and that's what they were keen for me to do. So hopefully we're going to be able to move towards that. To make all that work, we're probably going to try and look for some alternative sources of funding, notably from philanthropy, to allow us to do some of that. So you can probably feel that the organisation will move in that kind of direction to allow us to be even more credible on these things.
Fascinating. Sounds like a really exciting journey. Final question then. If you were advising a younger version of yourself starting out in their career and committed to climate change and having the greatest impact you could, which career incarnation of yourself would you tell them would have the greatest impact? In government or working in and for business?
Well, obviously, I would say come to Carbon Trust, Dan, or Aurora.
Yes,
so
Aurora.
One of those two institutions. I feel I had the best of it because I had a brilliant time working in government. I worked in various bits of government, not always on climate change. I had a really amazing early part to my career working in the Treasury on a host of things that were nothing to do with climate change, but that gave me a really good grounding on how government works. And I've turned that into what is now definitely my passion on climate, with the knowledge that I think I know how the policy-making machine works pretty well. But what's interesting is that more and more as my career's gone on, I find this interaction between government or policymaking and business is where the real creative stuff happens. So if you look at the big transition that we're seeing right now in electric vehicles, for example, that is happening slower than we might like, but it is happening now because there is an automotive sector that is interested in the government putting targets in place and policies in place to drive the adoption of electric vehicles. And that is a good example of where industry, when it gets its head screwed on, can do really good things. So I think I would say to my younger self, do what I did, get a grounding in how the world works, and then go into industry and see if you can make a difference. Because I think that it's the ambitious, enlightened corporates that will drive this. Now, if you really care about climate, that's where the action is, I think.
Awesome. Brilliant to end with a call to action there, Chris. So really fascinating as ever. Chris Stark, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Dan.
That was Dan Monzani, Aurora's Managing Director for UK and Ireland and European Hydrogen, talking to Chris Stark, CEO of the Carbon Trust. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.